Alright guys, today we are going to talk about sculpture. I apologize for the delay on the lecture. It's been a little crazy last week. I'm glad that we are back on track and we're going to talk about sculpture this week. So we are going to take a look at the first point, identify methods and material used to make sculpture. So these 2 points, we are not going to take a look at it this week. So sculpture, we talked about there are different types of sculpture. So this sculpture is called sculpture in round, means that it has all that three-dimensionality. So literally you can walk around and then see each angles, and then and you can appreciate each view and these artistic choices that the artist made. So we talked about this sculpture that is located in Chicago downtown called Cloud Gate, but people call it the Bean, created by British sculptor Anish Kapoor. So this is also sculpture round, meaning that you can literally go around and then appreciate the different view that the sculpture gives you. That's just me being stupid. So you can, well, this one actually literally go underneath as well. Same goes for this Louis Bourgeois sculpture right here. And another type of sculpture is called low relief. So it seems very flat, but it is still considered as sculpture. So it is called low relief because all the cuts and this three-dimensionality is very subtle. It's not as well defined as a sculpture in round or high relief, which we are about to take a look. So high relief compared to low relief, you can see that there's much more three-dimensionality has been put onto this work of art. So compared to this one, where it only has slight indication of three-dimensionality, here you can almost see this. I think you can almost see the entire arm sticking out and creating this higher level of three-dimensionality compared to low relief. So that's why it's called high relief, and the other one is called low relief. So those three are main type of traditional sculptures. Nowadays sculptures are kind of a disciplinary where pretty much everything that doesn't really fit into other categories are all come under the shared umbrella of sculpture. So for instance, performance art, time to time people call it a sculpture because it's happening in three-dimensional. And also installation art, which you, instead of making an object, you alter the space itself, is also considered as sculpture. But we are mainly going to be focusing on the traditional way of making sculpture. So let's take a look at methods of sculpture. So this is beautiful work by David Smith, whom we are going to take a look at in a minute. So first method is modeling. So in this work, clay has been used. So modeling, how it works is that you literally use the clay to add on to the surface to create a form. So instead of so when we think about the sculpture, we think about like a rock chisel and then chiseling, stone master just chiseling out a little bit to create a sculpture. Well, that's called a subtractive method, and modeling is often additive. So in this object right here, to create this form, artists add on to clays to create these facial features and this kind of a crazy looking hat and here and there. And next method is called casting. So casting is very process heavy of making work. So since metal, you can't really create it in additive, or I mean, you can work in subtractive method of creating the metal, but it's not very effective. So if you want to create anything, if you want to create a sculpture out of metal, the go-to method of doing so is casting. So it's very process heavy, and this explains how how the casting works. So here you model first, and then you create a mold, and then you melt all the wax out using the low melt kiln and pour the bronze in and all that stuff. So we're gonna take a look at this soon. So casting has been the traditional way of creating an important sculpture. So a lot of times when we see a lot of marble sculptures, those are commonly used as like a back in Greece, in ancient Greek time, commonly used as a model for like bronze sculptures like this. But there are only few surviving bronze sculptures. That is because whenever a regime changes or some other country conquers some country, or an empire falls, like Roman Empire, they tend to get melted down because bronze is very precious metal. So there are not a lot of surviving bronze sculptures. What we have is a lot of marble, because marble, what are you going to do? You can't really melt it. So this is one of the few of the surviving sculpture that is made in casted in bronze. So let's take a look at bronze casting. First, here he's using additive, the modeling method, to create his form that he wants to cast. You see he's modeling using the clay. And he used the silicone rubber to create the mold from that clay face that he made, and he's gonna pour wax in it so that he can create a mold around it. I think he's using silica casting, and then you can melt out the wax, and then he can pour the bronze in. So this is wax now. And you had to spend a lot of time this rod system so that it doesn't trap any air or void. Otherwise you will have like only half finished the sculpture. So that there's a lot of consideration and then science goes behind this. Make sure that air escapes. And he's gonna keep on putting silica to create a mold around it. And you do them multiple times until it creates really thick form around it. See how thick that is now? And then they put it. Then you put in the low melt kiln like this to just melt out all the wax, so that you create a void, a hollow mold inside where the bronze goes in. What's cool, you have all this your work and then this rod systems and everything. So you have to break the mold, give it a power wash to clean it out, and then use the heavy tool to clean it up. Patina is applied time to time, but I prefer just raw color of the bronze. Hina is pretty much giving like a chemical bath to a bronze surface to create a certain effect to it. That's what you have left with the bronze from clay to wax to bronze. So that is how bronze casting is done. And next we're going to take a look at iron casting. So depends on the material, the difficulty and the process is slightly different. So one of the easiest casting that you can do literally at your kitchen is pewter casting. So that pewter has really low temperature of melting point, so that you can literally put it on your stove and it'll melt, and then you can still cast it. And next most common material that artists use is aluminum. So aluminum has a much higher melting point. You are going to have to need a special kiln for this, furnace for this. And then there's bronze, and then there's iron, which is a lot heavier than bronze and also have a higher melting point. So it's very interesting, and this is all done at the Star Works, which is 40 minutes up north from the Richmond County. So they do it every year, and I think because of the COVID they didn't make it out like as a public event, but when they do it, always you can go check it out, and it's kind of cool. And you also create a little mold, sand mold at the spot to create this really cool looking low relief or high relief sculpture there. So let's take a look at how iron pour is done.
I've watched iron pours since the earliest years of my childhood, and every time I've watched one is just as exciting as the last time. Part of its awe-inspiring entertainment is of course all of the fire and molten iron, but a lot of it is thanks to the unique characters that you find in the iron casting community. Iron casting is a team art, it's not something you can really do by yourself. I mean, you try lifting one of these things on your own, filled to the brim with 3,000 degree liquid iron. Or don't. Actually, it's very dangerous. Always do this with a professional. Speaking of professionals, this is Mac. He's the one in charge of the Firefest iron pours. And this year, he's got Trip, Carl, and Joe as his right-hand men. These guys, they know what they're doing. With them is also a great team of support varying in degrees of experience. An iron pour doesn't have to consist entirely of experts, but it does require hard workers who are cooperative, attentive, and good listeners, which this crew certainly was. Not to mention they were just a lot of fun to be around. They're all unique characters with their own distinctly different styles of art, but all share a crucial element which brings them all together, their love of iron. So, we've got our dream team. Now what? There's a ton of prep work that goes into an iron pour. Firstly, the artist must have molds. Molds are made of sand and resin, and there are two types, closed and open-faced. The days leading up to the pour consist mostly of cleaning the furnace, breaking the coke, which is the fuel, and breaking the iron. Iron usually comes into a pour in the form of scraps, which then they make smaller into palm-sized pieces, or like little rocks. The day of the pour, there's usually someone still breaking iron. And the molds have to be set out in front of the furnace, and the bots, which plug the furnace later, are made out of clay, sand, and sawdust. The inside of the furnace is prepared too. First, you do what's called laying in the bed, by placing a layer of sand for insulation. On top of that, you need a thin layer of something to lock the sand in. Some people use a thin layer of clay and sand mix, but Carl here likes to use sugary soda drinks. Preferably grape soda, but we had to do with Dr. Pepper this go around. This, when lit under the charcoal, is caramelized, keeping the sand from flying around. On top of that is the coal, for ignition, and then a layer of coke, which you fill to the top of what's called the wind belt. Then you light it all up and wait for things to get nice and hot. The whole preparation is kind of a slow and quiet process with a lot of waiting, but the switch into action happens quick. When you start to hear the first shouts of you know that the time is near for the show to start. Soon comes the first tap. A tap is when they break the seal in the spout open. It's always so satisfying to see. and it amazes me how much iron flows just like water. Really, really hot water. There are specific assigned roles in an iron pour. Usually you have the pour master, who is the one who manages the pour team and directs the order of molds to pour into. The charger, who loads the furnace with coke and iron. The slagger, this person stands in the back of the furnace and keeps the flow of slag coming out of the furnace. The tapper, who breaks the seal open. The skimmer, who cleans the iron before pouring. Then the donkey and the pourer. The donkey holds the ladle steady while the pourer tips it over. Lastly, but also very important, we have the botter, the one who plugs the spout again, so, you don't have hot iron spilling everywhere. On closed molds, there's usually one or more pour cups and several vents to let air escape and to signal that you filled the mold enough. You've got to pour quickly because iron cools fast, and pouring too slow can cause deformities, cracking, and unevenness in your piece. For open-faced molds, you pour straight in, keeping an eye to make sure that the flow is even and consistent. For this pour, there were about 40 different molds, and in total they used around 1,200 pounds of iron, which, believe it or not, that's considered a small pour. The whole pouring process took about an hour and a half, and after all the molds had been filled, they realized they had some extra iron. Any extra iron after that is simply poured into the sand. This, once cooled, can be used later in another pour. The casters usually have a celebratory drink and take a break while they wait for their pieces to cool a little more. Like I said before, iron solidifies fast, so within an hour after pouring you can usually go ahead and open your molds. The artists get to see how their pieces turned out and often go ahead and start cleaning with wire brushes. Any unwanted sprues or extra metal flashing sticking out in odd places will be cut off and ground down later once everything is completely cooled off. This year, pretty much all the pieces turned out perfectly. There were no crazy mishaps, and even though it had been raining earlier in the day, the clouds held back entirely during the whole pour. Tripp claims he's the lucky charm. If it's raining, the rain always seems to stop once he lights the furnace. Maybe he's right. Who knows? What we do know is everyone had a great time and are already looking forward to the next time they can all get together to do another pour. And maybe next Firefest, you'll be able to join us too.
Alright, there's a Firefest at the Star Works Gallery, which is located in Star, North Carolina, about 40 minutes drive from Richmond Community College. So if the COVID gets better and then there is open to the public, go check it out. Alright, so next method that we're going to take a look is carving. So this is probably something that you kind of think of it as a de facto way of making sculpture, because a lot of the traditional sculpture has been used by this technique of carving. So what you see here, Michelangelo's David's sculpture was carved out of the Carrara marble, which is specific marble that is only mined from the area, and what they all use for the sculpture, Renaissance sculptures. So fun fact of this sculpture is that proportionally the sculpture is inaccurate. That is because his head is too big and his hands are too big as well. And that was intentional because it used to sit on on a roof of the cathedral, so people would look up instead of looking straight at it. So that is one of the reasons why Michelangelo wanted to make the head a little bit bigger, so that it kind of defies the perspective a little bit. So here, Michelangelo used the marble, but literally artists can use any kind of a stone or wood. So some people will carve out a granite, which is much harder stone than the marble, or wood is used time to time, but it's not as permanent as like a marble. And any kind of and plaster is also a great material for quick and kind of a not so permanent method. So let's take a look at how stone carving or carving of the to create a sculpture works.
I always find that you have to be a bit mad to become a stone carver. I mean, this isn't the Renaissance anymore. Stone isn't a primary building material anymore. Why would you go into an industry? Why would you go into a profession that is expensive and takes a lot of time, and the material is heavy and hard to move, and it is expensive to obtain even before you do anything to it. And then after that, even after you've made something out of it, you have to convince people that this is a worthwhile endeavor. But I always find that the answer to that question is always that there just wasn't any other option. Once the idea of becoming a stone carver comes into your head, then you just have to find some way of doing it. Every project will usually start with a sketch of some kind. And if you're lucky enough to have a live model, then it will start with a clay model. So if it's a head, you'll find all of the prominences, the sort of absolute prominences. You'll find the tips of the ears, you'll find the nose, you'll find the chin, you'll find where the underhang of the jaw comes down, you'll find where the sternal notch comes in, you'll find the top of the head. You'll find sort of the slope to the nose and usually the slope to the chin, and all the sort of angles that make up a human face, a sort of geometric head, if you will. The clay, when you do a clay model of someone, that's where you're working out the idea, and you're getting acquainted with their face, and you're talking to them and looking at them. And that's really what it's about, is just looking. A lot of people don't recognize the fact that clay is it's an easy substance, it's soft, you can move it around very fast, you can build it up really fast and then take it away really fast. And so there is no point in being precious about it. If you make a mistake, you can just discard that and start again, and it won't take that long. If you can imagine doing something, if you have the skills to do it, you can pretty much execute anything that you want. And that transition from your imagination through your eyes and your hands into a block of stone is the most incredible feeling. Stone carvers are often taught that simply carving something in stone is enough, that sheer ability to take something that's been cut from the earth and create something beautiful with it is enough. And that isn't something that is shared by any other kind of artist. Once you start carving this, there's no sort of hard and fast rules. You rely on the fact that you can look and measure, and that you have an instinct for this, and that if you can look at something and translate it into your hands and then make the chisels do what you want it to do, then you'll be okay.
This is the Moth Radio Hour from Sierra House. I'm Catherine Burns.
If you're doing the clay, or if you're doing the transition from the clay into the stone, often my brain is quite, not chaotic, but you're making so many decisions, probably until the sort of last day that you're working on it. Your brain is just constantly making decisions of like, have I taken that too low? Like, what am I doing? Like, what measurement is that? Like, where's this? Everything is just sort of going through your mind very, very fast. And you're not even aware that it's happening. But then you finish the day and you're exhausted and you wonder why. The sound that it makes is incredibly satisfying. A lot of people who aren't carvers comment on that, and that feeling of a well-sharpened chisel going into stone smoothly and cleanly, and that transition of looking at a stone and telling your hands to do something, and then your hands telling a chisel and a mallet to do something, and then have it take off exactly the right amount of stone, have it do exactly what you want to do, is the most satisfying feeling. On a human face, even though there's a change in pigment, there's no end. Like, you come to the edge of the lips and it just carries on going. And if you try and make it a stark difference, then the face will look strange. The skin is sort of a continuous surface that undulates and has tension in certain places and slack in other places. It takes a long time to train to be a stone carver, and it's not an easy job once you are trained, and you're still learning. I'm still learning. With every job that I do, I learn something new, and I will hopefully continue to learn. And that seems to be the payoff, that once you've created something, it takes up a physical space in the world, and it has a permanence that will hopefully outlast you, and it's not vulnerable either. I want people to see that I've pushed the material as far as it can possibly go. I maybe want people to see themselves in it. I want them maybe to wonder about my reasons for carving it. I want people to maybe argue about why I made it in the way that I did, and have different ideas of what the reason is and the purpose.
Right, again, from here, clay to stone, using the subtractive method of carving, in this case stone carving, to create this work of art. So as you can see, the sculpture can be very process heavy. So next technique that we're going to take a look at is a little bit more faster, I'll say. It's called assembling. So what you're looking at here is Mark de Souber's work, where he took steel I-beams, which are the construction material, and then he welded together to create this gigantic public sculpture. So assembling is pretty much literally taking different materials and putting it together. So it can be done in steel. A lot of times it's done steel over the past 50 years. And it can also be done with wood or cardboard or foam core or anything like that. So you take the different parts and put it together to create a work of art. So in this case, it'll be also additive method of creating art. It is called assembling. So one of the most influential sculpture that has to do with assembling different materials, especially like found objects, is David Smith, and we're going to take a look at his works.
Well, I've been more concerned with questions than I have with answers. And in my work, I really don't have any answers yet.
Everything inspired my father's work. Animals inspired him, the human form inspired him, the mountains, the sky, the clouds. His work came from everything.
He wanted to be an artist before I think he probably ever saw more than maybe just an incidental artwork. Way before he saw a museum, for instance. He had a lot to express, and it was like just an ongoing river of expression.
David Smith is one of the 20th century's most important sculptors. He was the first American to weld sculpture, and he had an enormous impact on the development of abstract art in the United States and around the globe. It's really been a dream of ours to make this exhibition possible at Yorkshire Sculpture Park. This comes on the tail of a number of really very significant monograph exhibitions that we've done, including Henry Moore, Isamu Noguchi and Joe Miro. For David Smith, having worked in the open air was really fundamental to how he developed his sculpture. For the majority of his working life, he had a studio up in upstate New York in a place called Bolton Landing near Lake George in the Adirondacks. And he would place the sculptures in the land around his studio and his house there. He called them his fields. And it was really important to how he thought about sculpture in relation to the weather, the light, the mountains, the trees.
His workshop was factory-like. It was very organized, and he kept it clean. He always whitewashed the floor so he could see his sculptures growing from the floor. And he would use his toe to knock pieces of steel into place and steady them, and then weld them together and make them upright. He had hoists and grinders and two kinds of welders, arc and acetylene. It was a very business-like, factory-like shop. And he called it the shop, not the studio.
We have been able to bring together sculptures which we're showing in the open air. It's a really wonderful opportunity for people to see Smith's sculptures, really in the conditions that he envisaged for them.
It's really wonderful to see the work in a different landscape setting, because I think that there's such a connection with nature in my father's work, and there always was. And in fact, the very earliest sculptures that he made were these little assemblages made from coral and rocks, and he took them outside and photographed them. So somehow bringing them outside seemed to be important even then in some really unexplored way.
Today's been quite emotional because we've taken the works out of their crates for the first time. And for me, looking at some of these pieces, they're works that I've looked at, when I was in my early 20s and a student. And it just seems amazing that they're here. Primo Piano is one of the late sculptures by David Smith. It's a large work where he's taken sheets of steel and welded them together, riveted them together in this quite geometric arrangement. All of those pieces of steel are pieces that he's found, and that's one of the very important features of David Smith's work. He's taking material from the workshops and industrial factories and all that kind of thing and bringing them into the studio. One of the most significant sculptures in the exhibition is called Hudson River Landscape from 1951. It's a loan from the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. And for me, I've been looking at this work since I was a student, and it just seems so extraordinary that it's here in the Underground Gallery. And it's a beautiful work that's a kind of somewhere between an abstract sculpture and a story. and it's David Smith's journey from Manhattan to his place in upstate New York. In it you can see rivers, you can see lakes, you can see clouds, railways. The work that's called Untitled Candida is maybe the last sculpture that David Smith made before he died in 1965. It's, again, planes of steel, so flat pieces of steel that he's welded together, but in this case, they're stainless steel. And we've sited this work at the top of the Bothy Garden, where it overlooks this fantastic landscape. And it's almost got a painterly surface where he ground the steel, and it collects light and it kind of throws light out. So it's actually kind of much bigger than it really seems.
I love seeing them here. This is a beautiful sculpture park. It's an experiential sculpture park. I love the life here. And he loved life. I think he would have loved being here among the landscape and the clouds and the sun and the rain and everything, the changing light, the ever-changing light here.
It fits. I mean, it's the best place to see them, even though a whole lot of them don't really go outside. There's always that connection to nature.
All right, so that's David Smith, an very important American sculptor who kind of introduced these steel sculpture, metal sculptures, where he used the creating this assemblage by putting things, found a piece of metal together to construct his composition. So he's very important figure. And this is one of his most famous work. I think the video talks about it. So that is it for today's lecture. So next lecture, we're going to take a look at film and photography, the digital media and things like that. And another thing that I want to mention is that the final exam, the final exam assignment is out. So make sure to plan ahead and then start working on it, because next week it is going to be the last day of the class, so that you only have less than 2 weeks to work on it. So make sure to get on it, and if you have any questions, just let me know, and I'll see you guys on the next video.